October 8, 2004. A fisherman stands by the Watery River Bridge in Richland County, South Carolina. The water flows quietly beneath him, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the riverbank. Clinton Brown, 56 years old, enjoys the peace that fishing brings. Behind him, footsteps approach. He doesn't turn around. Why would he? This is a public space. People pass by all the time. Then, a gunshot tears through the silence. The bullet strikes Brown in the back. He staggers, clutching his wound, somehow managing to get to his vehicle. Blood soaking through his shirt, he drives himself to Tuomi Regional Medical Center. He survives. But what he doesn't know in that moment of pain and confusion is that he has just become the first victim in a spree that will terrorize Sumter County for the next 8 days. 4 shootings, 3 dead, and a killer who knew some of his victims personally, who sat across from them at dinner tables, who called them friends. The man responsible would write messages in his victim's blood. He would arrange candles around a burned body. He would confess to murder on a voicemail, his voice calm, almost casual. And when investigators finally caught him, they would find stolen jewelry, firearms, and clothing that told the story of a methodical predator who had been hiding in plain sight. His name was Stephen Corey Bryant. He was 23 years old, and in just over a week, he would shatter the lives of multiple families and leave a community asking a question that still echoes today. How did nobody see this coming? Stephen Corey Bryant was born on April 12, 1981, in Sumter County, South Carolina. The region is rural, with stretches of farmland and small communities where everyone knows everyone. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and neighbors look out for each other. But behind closed doors, Bryant's childhood told a different story. His early years were marked by instability. Records show a household affected by substance abuse, where emotional neglect became the norm rather than the exception. As a child, Bryant displayed behavioral issues that teachers and family members noticed, but didn't fully understand. He was polite on the surface, the kind of kid who could smile and shake your hand. But underneath, there was something else, an impulsiveness that flared without warning, a volatility that appeared when stress mounted. The details of Bryant's childhood paint a disturbing picture of neglect and abuse. Defense attorneys would later argue that Bryant suffered repeated sexual abuse as a child by multiple relatives. The trauma began early and continued for years, creating psychological wounds that never properly healed. In the months and years that followed, Bryant began to unravel in ways that those around him either didn't notice or didn't know how to address. His mother's struggle with alcohol addiction played a significant role in shaping Bryant's development. Medical experts later testified that her binge drinking during pregnancy caused permanent damage to Bryant's body and brain. Fetal alcohol exposure can result in cognitive impairments, difficulty with impulse control, and problems with emotional regulation. These aren't excuses for violence, but they're factors that help explain how a person's capacity for rational decision-making can be compromised from the very beginning. Bryant also had a genetic disorder that compounded his developmental challenges. The combination of prenatal alcohol exposure, genetic factors, childhood sexual abuse, and emotional neglect created what psychologists describe as a perfect storm of risk factors. Each element alone might have been manageable. Together, they created a foundation that made Bryant vulnerable to the kind of psychological break that would occur in October 2004. As Bryant moved through adolescence and into young adulthood, his behavioral problems persisted. He struggled to maintain stable employment. His relationships with family members were strained. He began using drugs, self-medicating to cope with the trauma he had experienced and the psychological pain he carried. Friends and acquaintances described him as someone who could be pleasant and sociable one moment, then angry and unpredictable the next. But none of this suggested he was capable of murder. That's the difficult truth about cases like this. Most people who experience childhood trauma don't become violent criminals. Most people with mental health issues or substance abuse problems don't kill. Bryant's background explains vulnerabilities, but it doesn't draw a straight line to the crimes he would commit. In the weeks leading up to the October spree, people who knew Bryant noticed he seemed more withdrawn than usual. He talked less. His mood seemed darker. But these observations only make sense in hindsight. At the time, they seemed like minor fluctuations in someone who had always been somewhat unpredictable. What was happening inside Bryant's mind during this period remains largely unknown. He never provided a detailed explanation for why he started killing in October 2004. He never articulated what drove him from the life he had been living, however troubled, to the decision to take human lives. That transformation, from a struggling young man to a serial killer, happened behind a curtain we can never fully pull back. The first shooting happened on October 8th. Clinton Brown, the fisherman by the Watery River Bridge, became the opening chapter in a story that would dominate headlines for years. Brown was a working man, someone who found solace in the simple act of casting a line into the water and waiting to see what the river would offer. On that particular afternoon, the river offered nothing but trauma. The bullet that struck Brown in the back could easily have killed him. The fact that he survived, that he had the presence of mind and physical capability to drive himself to the hospital while bleeding profusely, speaks to remarkable resilience. But survival came with a price. Physical recovery from a gunshot wound is one thing. The psychological impact of being attacked for no reason, of having your peaceful afternoon shattered by sudden violence, creates scars that never fully fade. Brown's shooting sent ripples through the community. Who shoots a man fishing? What kind of person does that? Law enforcement began investigating, but they had little to go on. No witnesses had seen the shooter. No clear motive existed. Brown didn't know his attacker. He couldn't provide a description that would help police identify a suspect. The crime seemed random, motiveless, the kind of violence that terrifies communities precisely because it appears to have no logic. Detectives canvassed the area around the river bridge, looking for anyone who might have seen something unusual. They interviewed Brown multiple times, hoping he might remember a detail that could crack the case open. They examined the bullet recovered during his medical treatment, hoping ballistics analysis might eventually lead them to a weapon and a suspect. But at that moment, on October 8th, they had no idea they were looking at the first move in a rapid-fire killing spree. They treated it as an isolated incident, a disturbing crime, but not necessarily connected to anything larger. That assessment would change dramatically in the next 24 hours. 24 hours after Clinton Brown was shot, the violence escalated in the most personal way possible. Clifton Dale Gainey was 36 years old. He worked hard, enjoyed spending time with friends, and had known Stephen Bryant for years. They weren't just acquaintances. They were friends. Real friends. The kind who went fishing together, who shared meals, whose families knew each other. Gainey had worked at the same place as Bryant at one point. There was history there. Trust. The kind of bond that develops between people who have spent time together, who have talked about their lives, their hopes, their struggles. On October 9th, Bryant contacted Gainey with a simple request. He needed help buying beer. Could Gainey give him a ride? It seemed harmless. Just friends doing what friends do. Gainey agreed without hesitation. Why wouldn't he? This was someone he knew, someone he trusted, someone who had never given him reason to fear. They drove together to a secluded area. The details of their conversation that day are lost to time. Did they talk about work? Family? Did Gainey notice anything off about his friend's behavior? Did Bryant seem nervous, agitated, different in some way that Gainey couldn't quite identify? We'll never know. What we do know is that at some point during that drive, Bryant pulled out a gun and shot Gainey execution style. The betrayal runs deeper than the bullet. Execution style means Bryant shot Gainey at close range, likely while Gainey was defenseless, possibly while he was pleading for his life, or trying to understand why his friend had suddenly turned on him. The method of killing suggests cold calculation, rather than a heat-of-the-moment decision. Bryant had time to aim, time to pull the trigger, time to watch the life leave his friend's eyes. Gainey trusted Bryant completely. He got into that vehicle without hesitation because he believed he was helping a friend. Instead, he became the second victim in a spree that was gaining momentum. The killing of Gainey represented a boundary crossing that's difficult to comprehend. Shooting a stranger by a river is one thing. Murdering someone you know, someone who considers you a friend, someone whose family knows your family, requires a different level of psychological detachment. Gainey's family was devastated. They had welcomed Bryant into their lives. They had shared meals with him. They had trusted him around their loved ones. Now they had to reconcile those memories with the reality of what he had done. How do you make sense of that? How do you look back at photographs of gatherings where Bryant appeared, smiling and normal, knowing what he was capable of? The community reaction to Gainey's death was immediate and intense. This wasn't a random attack on a stranger anymore. This was someone killing a friend, someone they had broken bread with. The realization spread like wildfire through Sumter County. If Bryant could kill Gainey, who else was in danger? Were other friendships masks for potential violence? Could you trust the people you thought you knew? Law enforcement now had 2 shootings in 2 days. The connection between them wasn't immediately obvious. Clinton Brown and Clifton Dale Gainey had no apparent relationship. They moved in different circles. The crimes occurred in different locations. But investigators were starting to wonder if they might be dealing with something larger than isolated incidents. 2 days passed. October 10th came and went without reported violence. Investigators continued working both cases, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, building profiles. They didn't yet know that Bryant was planning something even more disturbing than what he had already done. October 11th brought the most disturbing crime of the spree, a murder so brutal and ritualistic that it would haunt investigators for years. Willard Irving Teachin Jr. was 62 years old and lived alone in Sumter County. He was a quiet man, the kind of neighbor who kept to himself but would help if you asked. His daily routine was predictable, his life orderly. On that October day, someone knocked on his door. Stephen Bryant stood on the other side, claiming his car had broken down nearby and he needed assistance. It's a classic ruse, but Teachin had no reason to suspect danger. This was his community. People helped each other. Vehicle breakdowns happened. Letting someone use your phone to call for assistance was just common decency. Teachin opened his door and let Bryant inside. What happened next revealed a level of cruelty that even experienced homicide investigators struggled to process. Bryant shot Teachin 9 times, 9 separate pulls of the trigger, 9 bullets entering a human body. This wasn't a single shot in a moment of panic or rage. This was sustained, deliberate violence. Each shot was a choice. Each shot required Bryant to maintain his intent to kill, even as Teachin's body reacted to the trauma. But Bryant didn't stop with the shooting. In an act that served no practical purpose, he burned Teachin's face and eyes. The burns were inflicted after death, meaning they weren't about causing pain to the victim. They were about something else. Destruction of identity, perhaps. Desecration of the body. Or simply an expression of rage and contempt that needed a physical outlet. Then came the ritualistic elements that would define this murder as something beyond a simple killing. Bryant found a potholder in Teachin's kitchen. He dipped it in the blood pooling around the body. And then he wrote messages on the wall. One read, "Victim 4 in 2 weeks." The misspelling was his, but the intent was clear. He was counting, keeping score, announcing his crimes to whoever would eventually find this scene. The message revealed something important about Bryant's state of mind. He wanted recognition for what he was doing. He wanted investigators to know this wasn't random, that there was a pattern, that he was in control. The reference to 4 in 2 weeks suggested he was planning more violence, that Teachin was just another step in a larger plan. Bryant then arranged candles around Teachin's body in a deliberate pattern. Investigators never publicly revealed the exact configuration, but witnesses described it as intentional, almost ceremonial. This wasn't something done quickly or carelessly. Bryant spent time creating this display, positioning each candle with thought and purpose. The combination of extreme violence, post-mortem mutilation, written messages, and ritual arrangement created a crime scene unlike anything most of the responding officers had encountered. This was performance. Bryant was creating a spectacle, ensuring his crimes would be remembered, that they would stand out from the routine murders that law enforcement deals with. After staging the scene, Bryant methodically stole valuables from Teachin's home: jewelry, firearms, personal items. Some of these he kept as trophies. Others he may have intended to sell. The theft added a practical element to what was otherwise a crime driven by psychological factors. Bryant was broke, unemployed, struggling financially. The stolen items had value beyond their symbolic significance. Before leaving Teachin's home, Bryant answered a phone call from Teachin's daughter, Kimberly Dees, who had called looking for her father. During the call, Bryant revealed that her father had been killed, stating, "You can't talk to him. I killed him. I'm the prowler." He ended the call abruptly, leaving Dees in shock. Imagine receiving that call. You expect to hear your father's voice, or a routine message. Instead, a stranger coldly admits to murdering him just hours earlier. The horror, the disbelief, and the grief are immediate. Dees later testified to the lasting impact of that call, explaining how the memory of hearing Bryant's voice that day haunted her, making it impossible to forget the moment she learned of her father's death. The Teachin murder scene traumatized everyone who encountered it. First responders, detectives, crime scene technicians, all of them carried the images of what they saw that day: the burned face, the blood messages on the wall, the candles arranged with such care around a brutally murdered man. These aren't things you forget. They're things that intrude into your thoughts at unexpected moments for years afterward. For Teachin's family, the horror was compounded by the ritualistic elements. It's one thing to lose someone to violence. It's another to know that their killer treated their body with such contempt, that he turned their death into a performance, that he bragged about what he had done. The grief was layered with rage, with a desire for justice that would take more than 2 decades to achieve. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. If you're still following this story, let me know by commenting, "Still here." Let's see who's keeping up with every detail. The spree continued. 2 days after Teachin's murder, Bryant struck again, selecting a victim with the same casual brutality that had characterized his previous crimes. Christopher Earl Burgess was 35 years old. He knew Bryant casually, the way you know someone you've seen around town a few times. Not friends, but not strangers either. Familiar faces in a small community where paths cross regularly at gas stations, convenience stores, local businesses. On October 13th, Burgess ran into Bryant close to a convenience store. They chatted briefly, the kind of small talk that punctuates everyday life. They drove together down a secluded road in Sumter County. The conversation was probably mundane. Weather, work, the kinds of small talk you make with someone you don't know well. Maybe Burgess asked where Bryant needed to go. Maybe they talked about nothing in particular, just filling the silence that can feel awkward between acquaintances sharing a car ride. Then Bryant pulled out a gun and shot Burgess twice. The vehicle rolled to a stop on that isolated road. Bryant got out, left Burgess's body where it fell, and drove away. There was no ritual this time, no messages in blood, no candles, just 2 bullets and a body left for someone else to find. A hunter discovered Burgess's body later that day. The scene was immediately recognized as suspicious. A man shot multiple times on a secluded road doesn't fit the profile of an accident or natural death. Law enforcement responded quickly, securing the scene and beginning their investigation. By this point, detectives had started connecting the cases. 4 shootings in 6 days, all in roughly the same geographic area. The timeline was too compressed. The similarities too obvious. They were dealing with a serial killer operating at high speed in a relatively small region. The investigation intensified dramatically. Detectives worked around the clock, pulling together evidence from multiple crime scenes, looking for patterns, building a profile of their suspect. The physical evidence was starting to point in one direction. Ballistics analysis suggested the same firearms were used in multiple shootings. Witness statements placed Bryant near several of the crime scenes around the times the murders occurred. The confession to Kimberly Dees gave them a voice to compare against potential suspects. investigators interviewed everyone who had recent contact with Bryant: friends, family members, co-workers, casual acquaintances. They executed search warrants on locations associated with him. They tracked his movements in the days leading up to and during the spree. A comprehensive picture emerged of a man who had been methodically planning and executing these attacks while maintaining enough of a facade of normalcy that people around him didn't realize what was happening. The break in the case came from the convergence of multiple evidence streams. The confession was particularly damaging. Voice analysis could match it to Bryant. The content revealed knowledge of Teachin's murder that only the killer would have. Combined with witness statements, physical evidence, and the emerging timeline, investigators had enough to move forward with an arrest. Later that same day, October 13th, officers arrived at the home of Bryant's girlfriend. They found him there, surrounded by the mundane details of everyday life. No blood-soaked clothing, no weapons in plain sight. Just a young man in a house, looking like anyone else. The officers took him into custody without incident. The 8-day spree was over. Bryant's arrest brought relief to a terrified community, but it also marked the beginning of a long legal process that would take years to complete. The investigation itself continued for months after the arrest. Detectives needed to build an airtight case that would withstand scrutiny in court. Search warrants yielded crucial evidence. In Bryant's possession, investigators found stolen firearms from Teachin's home. The ballistics matched bullets recovered from crime scenes. Jewelry belonging to the victims turned up, connecting Bryant directly to the murders. Clothing with blood evidence placed him at the scenes. Every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged, analyzed, and prepared for eventual presentation to a jury. The forensic work was meticulous. Blood spatter analysts studied the patterns at each crime scene, determining trajectories and positions. DNA technicians processed biological evidence, creating profiles that could definitively link Bryant to the victims. Fingerprint experts examined surfaces, looking for prints that would place Bryant inside Teachin's home and other locations. Digital forensics experts analyzed phone records, mapping Bryant's movements and communications during the relevant time period. Investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, people who had seen Bryant in the days leading up to the murders, friends who had noticed changes in his behavior, store clerks who remembered serving him, anyone who might have information relevant to building a timeline or establishing his state of mind. These interviews revealed a portrait of someone who had been increasingly isolated and troubled in the weeks before the violence began. Psychological profilers studied Bryant's behavior patterns in detail. The escalation from shooting a stranger to killing friends and acquaintances suggested a rapid psychological deterioration. The ritualistic elements at Teachin's murder scene indicated a need for control and recognition. The taunting messages revealed someone who wanted his crimes to be noticed, to stand out from ordinary murders. The theft of personal items as trophies fit classic patterns of serial killer behavior. One detective later described the investigation as watching someone who had been holding something back for years suddenly let go completely. The violence wasn't truly random, even though some victims were chosen opportunistically. Bryant had crossed a threshold where killing became easy, almost mechanical. The 8-day timeline suggested he was accelerating, that if he hadn't been caught when he was, more victims would have followed. The message about victim 4 in 2 weeks indicated he was planning to continue. The communities of Sumter and Richland counties were in shock. News of Bryant's arrest spread quickly, and with it came the realization of how close they had been to even greater tragedy. People who had known Bryant described him as quiet, even friendly. He didn't fit the stereotype of a violent criminal. He wasn't the person you'd see on the street and instinctively avoid. He was the person you'd wave to at the grocery store, maybe have a brief conversation with about nothing in particular. The trial began on September 2, 2008, nearly 4 years after the murders. The delay wasn't unusual for a capital case. Death penalty litigation is complex, involving extensive pretrial motions, jury selection processes that can take weeks, and preparation of evidence that must meet the highest standards of legal scrutiny. The prosecution needed time to organize their extensive evidence into a coherent narrative. The defense needed time to investigate Bryant's background and build their case for mitigation. Bryant made a decision that surprised many observers. He pled guilty to all charges. No lengthy trial with competing narratives about what happened. No attempt to claim innocence or challenge the overwhelming evidence against him. He admitted to everything. The shooting of Clinton Brown, the murder of Clifton Dale Ganey, the brutal killing of Willard Irving Teachin Jr., the murder of Christopher Earl Burgess. All of it. He acknowledged his guilt completely. This decision transformed the trial into a penalty phase proceeding. The question wasn't whether Bryant committed the crimes. The question was what punishment he should receive. Should the state execute him, or should he spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole? The prosecution presented their case methodically and comprehensively. They detailed each murder, walking the jury through the evidence step by step. They showed crime scene photographs that made jurors visibly uncomfortable. They called witnesses who testified about the impact on the victims' families. They reconstructed the timeline of the 8-day spree, demonstrating the acceleration and escalation of violence. They played the confession Bryant had told Kimberly Dees, letting jurors hear his voice admitting to murder with disturbing calm. Victim impact statements were particularly powerful. Clifton Dale Ganey's family members described the hole left in their lives. Children who grew up without a father. A spouse who lost a partner. The financial struggles that came with unexpected death. The nightmares that persisted years later. The anger that never quite dissipated. They spoke directly to the jury about what Bryant had taken from them. Not just a life, but all the moments that life would have contained. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. All of it gone because Bryant decided his friend's life was expendable. Kimberly Dees, Teachin's daughter, spoke about what it meant to receive that voicemail confession. She described listening to her father's killer speak with such detachment, treating murder like it was nothing more than a phone call you make to check in with someone. She talked about how that call haunted her, how she couldn't delete the recording because it was evidence but couldn't listen to it without reliving the horror. She described the nightmares where she heard Bryant's voice over and over, the psychological damage that extended far beyond the initial grief of losing her father. Clinton Brown testified about the lasting impact of being shot. The physical scars were visible, but the psychological scars ran deeper. He described the hypervigilance that developed, the inability to relax in public spaces, the way every unexpected sound made him flinch. He talked about how fishing, something that had brought him peace and joy, was now associated with trauma. He couldn't go to that river bridge without remembering the moment the bullet struck. The simple pleasure of a quiet afternoon by the water had been taken from him permanently. The defense focused entirely on mitigation. They didn't dispute the facts of the crimes. They didn't argue Bryant was innocent or that his actions were justified. Instead, they asked the jury to consider his background and mental state when determining his punishment. They brought in experts to testify about the effects of childhood trauma on brain development and adult behavior. Medical professionals discussed Bryant's genetic disorder and the documented effects of fetal alcohol exposure. They explained how prenatal alcohol exposure can cause permanent neurological damage, affecting impulse control, emotional regulation, and decision-making capacity. They presented brain scans and cognitive tests that showed Bryant's deficits. They argued that while he understood right from wrong on an intellectual level, his ability to control his behavior was compromised from birth. Psychologists testified about the impact of childhood sexual abuse. They described how trauma during critical developmental periods can fundamentally alter brain structure and function. They explained the concept of complex PTSD, where repeated trauma creates psychological damage that affects every aspect of a person's life. They noted that Bryant had never received proper treatment for his trauma, that he had been left to cope with devastating psychological wounds without professional help. Defense attorneys brought in witnesses who testified about Bryant's attempts to seek help before the murders. He had tried to address his drug addiction. He had spoken to people about his struggles, but resources were limited, and the help he received was inadequate. The defense argued that society had failed Bryant long before he committed his crimes, that proper intervention earlier in his life might have prevented the violence that erupted in October 2004. They presented evidence of Bryant's difficult childhood in detail. Witnesses testified about the abuse he suffered, the neglect he experienced, the chaotic household environment he grew up in. They painted a picture of a child who never had a fair chance, who was damaged before he could even understand what was happening to him. The defense didn't claim this excused his crimes, but they argued it provided context that should be considered when deciding whether to execute him. Bryant's age at the time of the murders was also highlighted. 23 years old, not a fully mature adult. Brain development continues into the mid-20s, particularly in areas related to impulse control and long-term planning. They argued that executing someone whose brain hadn't fully developed raised questions about proportionality and justice. The trial lasted 9 days. Both sides presented closing arguments that synthesized everything the jury had heard. The prosecution emphasized the brutality of the crimes, the number of victims, the betrayal of friendship, the terror inflicted on the community. They argued that some acts are so heinous that death is the only appropriate punishment. The defense acknowledged the horror of the crimes, but asked the jury to consider the totality of Bryant's life. They argued that understanding how someone became capable of such violence doesn't excuse it, but it should inform how we respond to it. They suggested that life imprisonment without parole would serve justice while acknowledging the complex factors that contributed to Bryant's crimes. On September 11, 2008, the jury returned with their verdict. Bryant received a death sentence for the murder of Willard Irving Teachin Jr., the crime the jury found most aggravated due to its extreme brutality and ritualistic elements. For the murders of Clifton Dale Gainey and Christopher Earl Burgess, he received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Additional charges related to the shooting of Clinton Brown and other crimes brought his total sentence to more than 100 years. Bryant's appeals process began immediately after sentencing. This is standard in death penalty cases. Every condemned prisoner has the right to appeal their conviction and sentence through state and federal courts. The appeals process is lengthy and complex, designed to ensure that no one is wrongfully executed, that every legal question is thoroughly examined before the ultimate punishment is carried out. Each appeal was reviewed carefully by the courts. Judges examined trial transcripts, reviewed evidence, considered legal arguments, and issued detailed opinions. Each appeal was ultimately rejected. The South Carolina Supreme Court upheld Bryant's conviction and sentence multiple times, finding no reversible error in the original trial or sentencing. Federal courts also reviewed his case and declined to overturn the state court decisions. For 16 years and 9 months, Stephen Corey Bryant lived on death row at Broad River Correctional Institution. Death row is a unique environment, fundamentally different from the general prison population. Prisoners are isolated from each other and from the regular routines of incarceration. They spend most of their time in individual cells, typically measuring about 6 by 9 feet. Human contact is minimal. Entertainment is limited. The days blend together in an endless routine of waiting. Bryant's time on death row was marked by several disciplinary incidents that revealed his continuing struggle with impulse control and anger management. He assaulted correctional officers on multiple occasions, violent outbursts that resulted in additional charges and restrictions on his already limited privileges. These weren't minor infractions. They were serious physical attacks on people who were simply doing their jobs. Bryant was still very violent even in prison. He engaged in fights and even threw urine on another inmate. These incidents resulted in even greater isolation for Bryant. He was moved to more restrictive housing. His already minimal contact with other prisoners was reduced further. The disciplinary reports documented a man who remained volatile and potentially dangerous even in the highly controlled environment of death row. Family visits were rare throughout Bryant's incarceration. According to prison records, he received minimal contact from relatives over the years. Some death row prisoners maintain close connections with family members who visit regularly, who write letters, who provide emotional support during the long years of appeals. Bryant didn't have that. His isolation was nearly complete, both physically in his cell and emotionally in terms of meaningful human connection. In the months leading up to his execution, Bryant did interact with a spiritual advisor. Many condemned prisoners turned to religion in their final years, seeking comfort, redemption, or simply someone to talk to who will listen without judgment. Whether Bryant found peace or continued to struggle with his past is known only to him and the advisor who counseled him. In 2025, Bryant's final appeal was denied. The South Carolina Supreme Court issued its ruling, finding no grounds to overturn the death sentence or grant a new trial. With all legal avenues exhausted, the execution date was set, November 14, 2025. South Carolina had resumed executions in September 2024 after a 13-year pause. The state had struggled for years to obtain lethal injection drugs, as pharmaceutical companies increasingly refused to supply medications for executions. This created a practical problem for states that wanted to carry out death sentences but couldn't access the necessary drugs. South Carolina's solution was to offer condemned prisoners a choice: lethal injection if drugs were available, electric chair, or firing squad. The addition of firing squad as an execution method generated significant controversy and media attention. Critics argued it was barbaric, a step backward to more primitive forms of punishment. Supporters argued it was actually more humane than other methods, providing quicker death with less potential for the prolonged suffering that can occur with problematic lethal injections or electric chair malfunctions. Bryant chose the firing squad. He would be the third person executed by this method in South Carolina in 2025, and the seventh person executed overall since the resumption of capital punishment. His choice was entirely his own. The state offered alternatives, but Bryant specifically selected firing squad over lethal injection or the electric chair. The execution protocol began days before the scheduled date. Prison officials notified Bryant formally, a procedure required by law to ensure condemned prisoners have adequate time to prepare. He was offered sedatives to help manage anxiety in the days leading up to the execution, though prison records don't indicate whether he accepted them. The offer reflects recognition that facing imminent death creates severe psychological distress, regardless of how that death will occur. Bryant was allowed to request a last meal, a tradition that dates back centuries in various forms. The reasoning behind last meals is partly humanitarian, offering a small kindness before the ultimate punishment, and partly practical, as it can help calm condemned prisoners in their final hours. Bryant's last meal reflected his personal tastes: seafood stir-fry, fried fish, egg rolls, stuffed shrimp, 2 candy bars, and German chocolate cake. There's something deeply human about this tradition. The state is about to take your life, but first, they'll give you whatever food you want. It's a strange mercy, a final acknowledgement that you're still a person with preferences and desires, even if those desires will end in a few hours. Some condemned prisoners choose elaborate meals. Others request simple comfort food. Some refuse to eat at all. Bryant chose foods that presumably brought him some pleasure or reminded him of better times. The execution chamber at Broad River Correctional Institution had been specially configured for firing squad executions. The setup is specific and carefully designed to be as efficient and humane as possible given the nature of the method. The condemned prisoner is strapped into a specialized chair with restraints that hold them securely in place. A hood is placed over their head, both to provide some dignity and to make the process easier for the executioners, who must aim at a living human being. A small target is attached to the prisoner's chest, positioned directly over the heart. This target gives the executioners a precise aiming point, increasing the likelihood of immediate death and reducing the potential for prolonged suffering. 3 executioners stand behind a wall with slots for their rifles. They're armed with .308 caliber rifles, powerful weapons used for hunting large game, loaded with a single round each. One rifle contains a blank round, so no individual executioner can be certain they fired a fatal shot. This provides a small measure of psychological protection for those tasked with carrying out the execution, allowing each to believe they might have been the one who fired the blank. The use of blanks is interesting from a psychological perspective. It doesn't change the reality that 2 of the 3 executioners definitely killed someone, but the uncertainty provides a mental buffer, a way of distributing responsibility that makes the task slightly more bearable. It acknowledges that even people who volunteer for execution duty may struggle with the weight of taking a life. At 5:50 p.m. on November 14, 2025, Stephen Corey Bryant was secured in the execution chair. Guards checked the restraints, ensuring he was held firmly but not painfully. The hood was placed over his head, eliminating his last view of the world. The target was positioned on his chest with precision, marking the spot where the bullets would strike. The warden read the order to proceed aloud, a formal recitation required by law. This reading serves multiple purposes. It confirms that all legal requirements have been met. It provides a record of the execution proceeding according to proper protocol. It gives witnesses, including victims' families, a sense of official closure. The order details Bryant's crimes, his conviction, his sentence, and the appellate process that led to this moment. Bryant was given an opportunity to make a final statement. This is his last chance to speak, to say anything he wants the world to hear. Some condemned prisoners use this moment to apologize to victims' families. Some proclaim their innocence. Some speak about their religious faith. Some make political statements. Some simply say goodbye to loved ones who are present as witnesses. Bryant remained silent. No dramatic confession. No tearful apology to the families he destroyed. No philosophical reflection on the nature of justice or redemption. No acknowledgement of his victims or their suffering. Just silence. The warden gave the order. 3 rifles fired simultaneously. The sound echoed through the execution chamber, a sharp crack that marked the moment of transition from life to death. 3 shots, carefully aimed at the target over Bryant's heart. The .308 rounds struck his chest with devastating force. Bullets designed to bring down large animals at distance don't leave much room for survival when fired at close range into a human heart. The physician confirmed the time of death minutes later. The execution was complete. Stephen Corey Bryant, born April 12, 1981, died November 14, 2025. The public reaction to Bryant's execution reflected the broader cultural divide over capital punishment that characterizes American society. Supporters pointed to the brutality of his crimes, the multiple victims, the betrayal of friendship, the ritualistic violence, the lack of remorse. They argued that some acts are so heinous that death is the only appropriate punishment, that society has a right and a duty to permanently remove those who demonstrate complete disregard for human life. For them, Bryant's execution represented justice served, an appropriate response to horrific crimes. Opponents questioned the effectiveness of capital punishment as a deterrent to violent crime, noting that decades of research have failed to show that the death penalty reduces murder rates. They pointed to the racial and economic disparities in its application, how poor defendants and defendants of color are disproportionately sentenced to death. They raised moral implications of state-sanctioned killing, arguing that executing someone, even someone who committed terrible crimes, diminishes society's respect for life. Slowly, over years, the community began to heal. The acute fear faded. People started leaving their doors unlocked again, though not everyone. The sense of safety gradually returned, though it would never be quite what it was before. The memory of those 8 days in October 2004 became part of Sumter County's collective history, a story parents tell their children, a reminder that violence can emerge from unexpected places. Advocates for children's mental health used Bryant's case to argue for better screening and services in schools and communities. They pointed out that many violent criminals have histories of childhood trauma that were visible to adults but never properly addressed. They argued for increased funding for mental health services, better training for teachers and social workers in recognizing and responding to trauma, and more comprehensive systems for protecting children from abuse. The question they posed was difficult, but important. If someone had intervened effectively when Bryant was young, could these murders have been prevented? We can never know the answer definitively. Not every abused child becomes a violent criminal. The vast majority of people who experience childhood trauma do not commit murder. The relationship between childhood experiences and adult violence is complex, influenced by countless variables including genetics, environment, social support, individual resilience, and pure chance. But the question remains worth asking because prevention is always preferable to punishment. If we can identify children at risk and provide effective interventions, we might prevent not just individual tragedies but entire chains of suffering. Every violent criminal has a history. Many have histories that include visible warning signs that were ignored or inadequately addressed. Society has an interest in investing in early intervention, not just for humanitarian reasons, but for practical ones. Prevention is cheaper than incarceration, and infinitely less painful than the suffering experienced by victims. Stephen Corey Bryant was executed in 2025. He was 44 years old. He spent more than 20 years between his crimes and his death, almost all of it isolated on death row, waiting for a date that everyone knew would eventually come. Whether those 20 years constituted justice or merely prolonged suffering for everyone involved depends on perspective. The victims' families can finally move forward without the specter of appeals and hearings hanging over them. The case that has dominated portions of their lives for over 2 decades is finally, definitively closed. There will be no more court dates, no more news coverage of legal challenges, no more uncertainty about the outcome. That finality, regardless of how one feels about the execution itself, provides a form of closure. Sumter County can continue its healing process, though the scars will always remain. The story of the 8-day spree will gradually fade from headlines, becoming part of local history rather than current events. New residents will move in who don't know the story firsthand. Time will do what time does, softening the sharpest edges of trauma while preserving the essential memory. But it won't be forgotten. Cases like this don't disappear from collective memory. They remain as reminders, cautionary tales, moments in a community's history that define how people think about safety and danger, trust and betrayal, justice and punishment. The story of Stephen Corey Bryant will be told for generations, not because people want to remember horror, but because remembering serves a purpose. It honors the victims. It acknowledges the suffering. It reminds us that beneath the surface of normal life, violence remains possible, that the people around us carry secrets we can't see, until those secrets explode into action. The story of Stephen Corey Bryant is finished. The legal case is closed. The appeals are exhausted. The execution is complete. But the suffering he caused continues, carried forward by the people who loved his victims, by the survivor who bears his scars, by the community that lost its innocence during those 8 terrible days in October. Which cases do you want to be covered next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Your engagement helps me bring you more in-depth coverage of the cases that need to be told.